And we're on. Kathryn Bruni-Young, thanks for being on Fitness and Consciousness.
Thanks for having me.
So I found out about you through your mom's Facebook group that I'm a part of. She has this massive 20,000 person or something like that, and group full of like yoga instructors and people that practice different movement arts. And it seems like this um, like the winds of like movement and yoga are changing, and like you're like part of this um, change. So how did you get into movement? Do you call like what you do yoga, or do you do yoga, or like what is it that you're doing in this world of movement?
So I got into movement and sport as a kid. I think I was always a very active and athletic kid. So I did dance classes for a long time. I played sports at school a little bit. I always gravitated though towards more of like the individual sports like dance and gymnastics and stuff like that. I remember I would just like go into the backyard or go into the basement and do like dance routines and gymnastics routines for hours, even just by myself. I really liked the feeling of exercise and moving around and really challenging my body. I remember as a kid just doing like push-ups, like, let me see how many push-ups I can do as like a, 10, 12-year-old girl. I think some people in my family thought I was a little bit nuts, but it just felt like the right thing to do. And I always really enjoyed movement. I didn't really think about it a lot when I was a kid. It was just something that I did. And then I eventually started to get more into yoga because obviously my mom was practicing yoga all the time. So I also grew up in a house where, like someone practicing yoga every day was totally normal. I would watch her do it. I would watch the videos that she was watching at the time as well, practicing from the videos. And it was always a practice that was really like available. I knew what the poses looked like. I knew what the kind of sequences looked like. So I think by the time I was maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, I started to do some yoga with my mom. And honestly, at the beginning, like I didn't really like it that much. I was like, oh, compared to dance and gymnastics, like this is kind of boring. This is really slow. I like to hang around with my mom. I think that's what really got me into it at the beginning. But the practice itself, I wasn't really that interested in. Eventually, though, I started going to her classes at the studio. And still at the beginning, I was like, oh, this is so hot. Like, we're all so sweaty. I don't know about this. Little by little over time, I was less interested in doing sports, and then I became more interested in doing yoga. I stopped doing dance classes. I stopped doing gymnastics, and then I got pretty much fully fledged into yoga, practicing with my mom at her studio and also practicing with some of her teachers as well. So like mainly Ashtanga yoga at the beginning, and then we started branching out into more styles of vinyasa as the years went on. And I did teacher training program at my mom's studio I think I started when I was 16, ended when I was 17. The following year I started teaching a teen class in one of her studios. There had never been a kids or a teen class up until then. So it was like this perfect fit for me. And I really loved teaching that class. It became this like really popular class. It was the one class a week where like kids and teenagers were welcome to come. And I remember it being like really busy. Like some weeks at the peak of it all, I would have like 30 teenagers
Oh, wow.
like lining up outside the studio, and it was kind of this like spectacle. It was kind of funny thing for
Amazing.
like the rest of the teachers to see. And I taught that class for 3.5 years. So that gave me like this initial practice and confidence. I got to test things out, see how things went. And then from there, I was eventually allowed to start teaching some adult classes. And then it just built from there. One class a week turns into 6, 7, 8, 9 classes a week, turns into a full-time schedule. Then I started teaching workshops and just learning more about movement. I got to the point where I realized I had some repetitive strain issues happening. I was doing way too much yoga, way too much of one thing. And that's when I got more into strength training and different types of strength and movement practice with different teachers. And that was really the turning point to where I am now, where most of the people I teach are yoga people, either teachers or practitioners. Everyone who hosts my workshop is a yoga studio or a yoga teacher. But I don't really market what I teach as like yoga or yoga poses anymore. I mean, I don't teach a lot of yoga poses. We'll get into it a little bit in the context of like strength and how can we add strength to yoga poses and mobility and stuff like that. But I definitely don't go into a class and teach a series of yoga poses anymore. Although the way that I teach kind of feels like people are doing yoga, you know, I'm also not going in and saying, okay, guys, let's do 20 push-ups, go, 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 go. Definitely feels like the overall environment of the yoga class. We warm up slowly. We cool down at the end. We always lie down at the end for a few minutes. So yeah, it's really changed over the years, and it's kind of like continuing to change as my interests grow. But that's kind of how it started and how I've got into this point.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So I'm thinking of you teaching and all the kids, like these teenagers, and this thing that they're being a part of. Like what was it that I guess it'd probably be different ones to different kids, but like did you have like a were you talking like spirituality stuff during your classes, or was it just like more like a fun kind of thing, or like what was it about your like class for teenagers that made it so popular? I would think that would be I think that would like normally not be a popular class for a lot of places, but
I think part of what made it so popular was, so this was like 10 years ago. 10 years ago in Toronto, I mean, there were yoga classes popping up everywhere, but there were not a lot of classes for young people. I think the overall like vibe of a typical yoga studio is quite serious, and one where, you know, like kids and teenagers are not really welcome in a lot of the classes unless they're going to also be like really quiet and really serious. And so I think part of it was like, well, here's this class for teenagers. Also, I was a teenager at that point. So I was like telling all my friends and all their friends to come to my class. So I was the perfect promoter for my own class. And I mean, I definitely at that time, you know, I wasn't teaching like a class for kids. I wasn't, you know, it wasn't overly fun. I don't think it was overly like, it wasn't silly. It wasn't like a typical, I don't know. It's not what I would imagine a kids or a teen class being like. I felt like I was just teaching a normal class. And I mean, I was a teenager, so, you know, there's that. But it was a pretty legit yoga class. I don't think I talked a lot about spirituality. I mean, whatever that is. I definitely didn't talk a lot about like Sanskrit words of poses. That wasn't really my style. Hadn't had a lot of training in that. And also like the people who were coming to my classes, I mean, I don't think they would have really connected to that too much. Yeah, it wasn't, I think it was pretty much like an Ashtanga class, modified primary series. That's all I knew at that point. That's what I taught. And it was kind of like, come do this thing. And if you like it, you should come back. And honestly, a lot of the people who came while they were there with me in the room, I had the feeling that like they didn't like it at all. But they would always come back and everyone would come back. And I mean, it was very mixed ages. Like I think I had a few 9-year-olds at one point coming all the way up to 17 and 18. So it was total mixed bag. But when I remember back to those years, I feel like I was just teaching a normal class, that was full of teenagers. It'd be interesting. I'm not in touch with anyone who is ever in those classes anymore, but it'd be interesting.
I was about to ask you that.
Yeah. It would be interesting to talk to someone who was in those first few classes. To see what they remember.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I would imagine like some monks, like yoga has this kind of mystique about it, and yeah, there's the physical stuff. You get to stretch and loosen up, and but then there's that like something that like even if people get into it for mostly like physical reasons, then that like something starts to happen. Like there's something about it that like makes you like less reactive. So if somebody cuts you off in traffic, instead of screaming at them, you just hit the brake and slow down a little bit, and it's not a big deal anymore. And so people kind of like see, they start like treating people better, or they start seeing these changes in their life that like maybe they weren't expecting, because yoga is just stretching. Like I was a trainer. It was I started this training at this place in like 2001 as a personal trainer. And I remember like the owner, he was like, well, yoga's good for stretching, but it's just like didn't get it. And so I would imagine like some of these kids, like maybe the ones that were more like the hippie kids, or like maybe they're feeling something different than the ones that are like, oh, this will help my basketball or something like that. So I would imagine, so like in that class, if you like remember, how old are you now?
I'm 29 now.
Okay, 29. I'm 39, so I'm trying to like put this into. So I don't know if there was like hippie kids like coming to your classes, or like was there like a particular like type of kid, or not necessarily all different ages, but
Yeah, all ages. Honestly, I mean, so some of the people I knew because they were my friends. The location of where I was teaching the class was a very family-oriented neighborhood, so like super residential. There were lots of kids living around the area, so I think a lot of those people started coming as well. And a lot of them I didn't know. Like they literally show up to my class. I kind of like maybe knew their name, but that was pretty much it. I didn't know a lot about them. It seemed like a real mix. Yeah, it didn't seem like it was one type of kid or a group of kids who like dressed a certain way or did a certain thing. Some of them were athletic, some of them were very like not athletic. For a lot of them, it was really difficult. Like the poses were hard. It was a physical experience to get through the movements. I mean, it's possible that the class attracted kids and teens who like were not interested in team sports. Like I wasn't really interested in team sports. So I think it's possible that those types of people would have come to the class because of the physical nature, but more individual. And then of course, like, going to a yoga class is different than like going to play soccer or something. It's a different experience. It's a different feeling. The calm down, the cool down leaves you feeling differently than going to a class at the gym would have you feeling. And I think that for teenagers, like that's helpful. I mean, for all humans, I think that's helpful. But in that time when there's like so much angst and anxiety and just all of these feelings, if people can go to a place once a week and like do some movement and like burn some energy and then calm down at the end, I think that's really helpful. And I think that's probably the most helpful part of this kind of like vinyasa yoga experience.
yeah, it sounds like a really cool thing. And like, were you playing music? Were you playing like no music? Just
no music. I was teaching the Ashtanga series. Let's be serious. Mm-hmm. At that point in Toronto, 10, 12 years ago, no one was playing music in their classes. It was not a thing. I didn't feel like I was allowed to play music in my classes. No one did it. There were no sound systems in yoga rooms. Obviously that's changed. That's changed quite a bit. And eventually I did start playing music in my classes, but not in those teen classes. It was very yoga scene.
Yeah, it sounds really cool. I would hope people that are listening could kind of take note of that. And maybe there is that 18-year-old who's been coming for a while, once has done the training, but maybe they're not quite comfortable teaching 50-year-olds or something like that. Give them a shot at a teen class and see what happens, because it could really help a lot of people. Like you're saying, like maybe they're not good at like team sports. They don't like team sports. They can still be part of this community. Like you're still like in this thing together, and you're kind of getting through it, like the difficult parts and these breakthroughs. And so anyway, I guess fast forwarding a little bit. So you started getting into more like movement stuff because you were having like these repetitive injuries. And like, so what like instructors were you looking at? Was like Ido Portal and like who like were you looking at? I'm like, oh, I need to like, maybe I should do more of that, or maybe I should.
Yeah. So I met Ido Portal in Toronto the first year that he ever came to Canada. Kind of by chance, a friend of mine recommended that I go take his workshop if I ever had the chance to take it. And then a few weeks later, he was in town. I had never heard of him before. I had watched like one of his videos on YouTube. At that point, I was really into like handstands and arm balancing and all that kind of stuff. But also I had never been to a gym. Like I had never lifted a weight. I had never done training outside of yoga for at least 5 years, probably more than 5 years. So I went into that workshop and I had no idea what to expect. The workshop was called hand balancing. And it was a little bit of everything: locomotive movement, handstands, strength, a little bit of lifting, remedial exercises, rotator cuff exercises, hanging, pulling, really a little bit of everything. And in that workshop, I started to realize like, okay, my body feels strong when I'm doing yoga poses, but it feels really weak if I try to do anything else. And that was a turning point because I was used to feeling like, okay, I've got this like super like advanced yoga practice, super strong, really good at it. But now I'm going into this other practice and my body is really quite weak in some positions. And I realized how one-sided the practice I was doing had been. And I just realized, like maybe some of these little aches and pains I'm having in my body are from lack of strength and lack of load in some positions and weakness and just an overall lack of balance, like to do only one thing, one series of poses for 5 years. Now I look back on that. I'm like, oh, of course I had repetitive strain injuries. Like, what do you think is going to happen? But at that point, like none of my yoga teachers were talking about cross training or going to physio or doing anything for your injuries. The only thing I had heard was like, back off a little bit, rest, do something that's more gentle, and hopefully your knees won't hurt anymore. And hopefully your lower back won't hurt anymore. No one had ever told me, why don't you like put some load on those parts of your body? Why don't you try to strengthen the tissues around those joints, see what happens, or do something different, or go for a walk or whatever. So when I met Ido, we spent a week together training in Toronto. And then the following year, he came back to Toronto and we hosted him at my mom's yoga studio. Again, we spent another week together. It was wonderful. And in between those two kind of like intensives, I just practiced everything he taught me. It was a bit of like a rude awakening, like people who follow Ido Portal know that he's not like, he's not really pulling any punches, It's pretty much like, here's my opinion and you can take it or leave it. Mm-hmm. And so it was a little bit more abrasive than what I was used to. I was used to yoga teachers who were like going to sugarcoat everything and make it so that like nobody's feelings got hurt. And, that was not the approach, but at the same time, what he was saying made so much sense to me that I was just like, oh shit, like maybe he's right. And so, that approach is not for everyone. And that's definitely not the approach that I take when I work with my students. But in my case, it was quite helpful. It kind of like opened up my mind to, okay, there's a whole other world out there that you are missing. And maybe it would be good for you to like hang from a bar and do some deadlifts and move your body around, do some locomotive movement, move not on the spot, like how long had I been doing my whole movement practice on one mat? I was basically doing my whole movement practice standing on the spot,
Yeah.
Which like is helpful. I often teach classes still on yoga mats. It is helpful to feel like you have your own little space and it's all mapped out for you. It's a nice little bit of cushioning. It is helpful, but at the same time, for that to be your only experience of movement, physical training, it's like, it's not normal to just move on the spot. You know, this is my opinion after like all of these years of doing different types of things. And so that's what I got from working with him. Totally changed the way I was even perceiving what a movement practice was. That was almost 7 years ago now. And so it's taken me a long time to step back from what I was doing before, which was mainly Ashtanga yoga, and then start to implement new things. It's taken me 7 years for my opinions on these things to change so drastically. This was not an overnight change that happened. After those 2 intensives working with him, I joined the CrossFit gym. I did CrossFit for a year, which was fun. You know, it was pretty high intensity. It was just also like making friends with new people. You know, like all my friends were yoga teachers. And at that point, no one was teaching strength in yoga. And most of the people at the studio thought I was nuts. Like all the other teachers in the studio didn't just jump on board and say, hey, maybe this does make sense. Let's take a look at this. You know, like they thought I was freaking crazy. And so I needed to make some new friends and meet some new people. And going to CrossFit helped me with that because it's super community based. Whether or not it's the most practical movement practice is another story, but I never got hurt doing it. And I think that was a good sign, at least for me. After about a year of that, I was tired of the like super high intensity, wasn't really enjoying it. I realized, okay, this is turning into more of like an obsessive exercise routine than anything else. But it was at the CrossFit gym that I met my personal trainer, who then I worked with very, very closely for a couple of years. And through that time, all of the repetitive injuries I had accumulated doing too much yoga completely disappeared. I got into powerlifting. I did a couple of powerlifting competitions, which were just something to train for, like just a goal to have, something to work towards. And that was really, really helpful because it got me into a new type of movement practice. I was still practicing yoga. I was still teaching yoga. Like I was going in and teaching my vinyasa classes and trying to bring elements of strength into it all the time. But it was a gradual and slow process. And I think that's also why my teaching stayed popular. Like, it's not like, because the people I was teaching at the studio, like they wanted to go to a yoga class, right? They didn't want to come and do bodyweight training or strength training. They thought they were going to yoga class. And so I would go in, teach my class, slowly bring in elements of strength. 5 years goes by, and at the end of the 5 years, we're doing all these different kinds of movements. We're moving off of our mats. We're doing all these different things, but the progression has been so slowly that no one got really turned off of it all. And I think that that's really important because I know other teachers who have had this epiphany more overnight and go into their class the next day and just teach like whatever, push-ups and squats or whatever it is. And people are not happy with it. And people say, this isn't yoga and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, I understand this from both angles. I obviously understand that like you need to do different things side of this from the teacher's perspective, but also on the student's perspective. Like I didn't quit yoga overnight, I was continuing to do a hybrid of different practices for years and still continue to. So I think when we oversimplify it as teachers, we start to lose people. And if we can start to really like bring in these different elements, kind of combine them together a little bit, we're going to be more successful and like not lose too many students.
Yeah, it makes sense. The people have like this idea of what it's supposed to be in their mind. And I think people think of it as, it's this, people have been doing it exactly this way for thousands and thousands of years. But that's really probably not the case. Of course, people have been, bending over and touching their toes for a very long time, but putting it together the way it's put together and just isn't quite the thousands of year old practice that people have in their mind. And I think that like you're talking about like deadlifts and powerlifting. So if yoga is like like concentration, like concentrating on what you're doing and like eliminating like the chatter in your mind, or people have different definitions of it. But if that's one of them, to stop that like monkey mind, or whatever you want to call it, try doing your like a max deadlift while thinking about like your credit card bill. It's not going to happen. You have to like just concentrate on the deadlift. You're concentrating on your form and making sure your everything is tight where it should be tight, so you can lift heavy, but you're not like riding the brakes on the way up, and you're not. So it's like a max deadlift can be like more of a yoga to me than somebody going through this even like a stronger practice where, oh yeah, they're doing yoga, they're doing up dog or down dog, up dog, and then all this. Like maybe that's not even really yoga for that person, but they hit that deadlift and it's like they're just concentrating. There's nothing else going on except that max deadlift. So do you kind of like see it like that way also, where like, why isn't a deadlift yoga? I mean, you see like the big guy at the gym with chalk all over him, and he's but he's deadlifting 700 pounds. Like, you telling me that guy can't concentrate at least as good as the person doing this in the, with Lululemon clothes and stuff?
Yeah. So my question is, why is it that we need to call movement practices that are mindful and focused yoga? It's like, why do we need to call these things yoga?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, maybe some people aren't going to like this, but I don't know. To me, it's like, if you're doing yoga poses, then you're doing yoga. If I'm powerlifting, I don't necessarily think of that as yoga, but I just say it's powerlifting. But why does it have to be called yoga to mean I'm mindful and paying attention and embodied and spiritual? Because I feel like if I go do the powerlifting, or if I go into the gym, or if I go for a walk, if I go for a run, I can be having the same mindful, embodied, spiritual practice as I'm having when I'm doing yoga poses. And I think to just automatically assume that weightlifting or running or stretching or something, tennis, whatever, is not as mindful and embodied as something as yoga is, I think we're missing the boat a little bit. Mm-hmm. I think that we assume that people who lift weights are going in there and just listening to rap music and zoning out and, I don't know, just grunting and being like dumb jocks. I think that is the perception, especially from people who do yoga. I think there can be a little bit of judgment, and I think some of that is probably appropriate. Like, I've been to gyms before. I know what goes on in there sometimes, but I also think that everyone is in that environment doing their own practice, having their own experience, and you could totally be zoning out and thinking about 100 different things and not paying attention and not be in your body and having a mindful experience. Or you could be in the gym doing the exact same movements with a whole different intention, having a totally like yoga, whatever, mindful experience, similar to you can be on a yoga mat, doing your yoga poses, being so in tune and in your body and moment to moment. Or you could be on the yoga mat doing the poses, thinking about your lunch, or zoning out, or being really competitive with yourself, or whatever. Like, I think that the intention and the mindset is everything. I think if we take that intention and mindset into different types of movements, there's not too much of a difference to me, whether you're deadlifting or whether you're doing warrior pose. But I just think that one of my teacher trainees asked me this question at the end of our program this past year. And this was a small teacher training program I taught in Cornwall. So it was only 8 people. So we really got to know each other. And at the end of it, she was like, why don't you call the classes you're teaching yoga? Because I call the classes that I teach mindful strength. And I said, I could call them yoga, or I don't have to call them yoga. It doesn't really matter at this point. I call them mindful strength because that's my choice. But why is it that if for a class to be mindful and embodied, we need to call it yoga? Mm-hmm. It's like, why can't body weight movement or Pilates or a stretching class or a strength class or a weightlifting class, why can't that have the same mindset? And it's like, I think that when people are really, really in love with yoga, they want to expand the meaning, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, how do you define something that you really love? It's like this huge, broad definition. It's like, how do you define your child? How do you define your partner? How do you define the sport that you love so much? There's so much to it. I think this is why we're opening up what yoga is, which I think is very helpful. Like it's helpful that everyone right now is kind of like coming up with their own definition of yoga. Like that's great because people are becoming more open-minded. But at the same time, I also think that to have a movement practice that's mindful and in tune and focus, I don't think it needs to be called yoga.
Yeah, I agree. And it seems like more and more now people are like listening to people like you and like seeing things different. And it's like there's something about the word yoga that like people can, like this yoga teacher must be like more spiritual than me, so I'm going to learn spiritual stuff, and there's like some kind of like transcending like where we are now. So it's like this really powerful word. Maybe part of it is marketing, but like words have like power on their own. And like you ask, like there's different documentaries like will go around even in India, like what's yoga, and they're talking to a bhakti yoga guy. And so he's talking about what yoga is. He doesn't mention anything about poses or anything. And then they go to another guy, karma yoga. And then they go to the Patabi Joyce, or they go to Iyengar, and they're all speaking about it differently on what it actually is. But people want to say, yeah, I'm doing yoga. And the first, I don't know when I first heard about it, but I got my first 2 yoga books when I was 15 at a Grateful Dead concert. And that was like in 1994. And it was Krishna consciousness stuff. Like, you know who Prabhupada is? He's he came here from like India in the 60s, and he was like popular with like a lot of the hippie community. And he was in India. So he was, it was like this big movement, Krishna consciousness stuff. So it was all just like karma, bhakti. And so that's what I was like reading about. And I could see all these, like the pictures, like these. And at the time I was, at a Grateful Dead concert doing Grateful Dead concert stuff. But so I'm like looking at these pictures, and they were just blowing my mind, like just how detailed they were. And like the more you looked at them, the more you could see. Like you couldn't just like look at it, and then talk about what it is. It took a long time to see these pictures because there's so much into them. So I knew there had to be some kind of spirituality behind them, because you can't paint something like that without something like divine or something like that kind of source guiding you, or some kind of connection with the. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then when I was about 18, I started taking jiu-jitsu, traditional, and a lot of the warm-up looked like yoga poses and stuff. And then it was just about like 5 years ago or something like that I took my first yoga class, and it was supposed to be like this really good teacher. And like I decided, I was like, I'm going to do this teacher training through him. And it was going to take over 1,000 hours to get a 500-hour certification through him, because he was just like so thorough. And then he ended up being kind of a creepo dude. And so I quit going there. But so that was kind of like how I got into it. So then like when I'm seeing like what other people are calling yoga, and then like what you're saying about why can't the deadlift be included in that, or the powerlifting, or like why do we have to like name it certain things? Because you can like look at a lot of these lifters, and if you talk to them, there is like it is kind of a spiritual thing to them. And then like using like the mace and different like clubs and stuff now, Like you
Yeah.
start like digging into these guys, men and women both, of course, and there's like something spiritual going on in this strength practice, and it just seems like it's like spreading out more and more. So I guess like so you're calling your classes like mindful strength. So like, can you like describe like what's it look like? How do you start? And like, what does a typical class look like?
Okay, so the classes I teach in my little studio are small classes. So I only take 8 people at a time. The people sign up for a 4-week session. So I'm working with these same people, and most of the time it's the same people who sign up session after session. So it's a small group of people. I work with them fairly consistently. Most of them are over the age of 50, anywhere from like 50 to 70. There's a couple 30-year-olds, but not a lot. And the class is about 75 minutes long. We start off with like a dynamic warm-up of some sort. So, oh my God, it's so varied. We could be balancing a ball. We could be doing some footwork. We could be balancing on a stick, leg swings, something like that. Dynamic warm-up depending on what's happening that day in the class. Then we just get into some, strength and mobility movements. Maybe we do some shoulder work, joint articulation, shoulder circles, spinal movement. We always do some type of standing series. So maybe we do like single leg deadlifts with the block. Maybe we do some type of lunges or some type of squats. Although, like the people who come to my class, like they need preparation. Mm-hmm. They're not ready to just jump down into squats. We always do some type of like table movements, whether it's like quadruped movements, hip circles from a table, something like that, wrist work, always some type of lying down on the front of the body, always some type of lying down on the back of the body. Sometimes we do more Pilates movements. It's really a mix. Every class is different. There's no series. Sometimes we'll focus on upper body. We'll do some pushing. We'll do a little bit of pulling. I have props, like I use blocks. I've got squishy Pilates balls that we use. I have a couple kettlebells. So if I'm teaching a private client, we'll do some kettlebell work. We'll do some weightlifting. The classes are really simple though. It's really basic. And I think it's also super basic and simple because like the people I'm working with don't have a lot of exercise background. Most of the people who are coming to my class here are women. Most of them have never participated in any type of exercise program in the past. And so we're kind of like starting at the beginning again, and it's all just based around functional movement. So when you look at like how the class is structured, there's a warm up, we level it off for a little while, there's a cool down, and then we lie down for 5 minutes at the end, like you would in a yoga class. And, within that kind of framework or template, then we just mix and match the poses every class, depending on who's there and how people feel and stuff like that. But that overall framework does stay the same. Like I'm not having people come in, we do like 3 sets of 9 reps, and then we rest for 2 minutes. It's not structured like a workout. It's structured like a yoga class. It's just that most of the movements are more strengthening or mobility. So like active range of motion stuff. I have some yoga tune-up balls in my studio. Sometimes we do a little bit of self-massage because for the population I'm working with, sometimes that's really helpful. And really just trying to teach people how to have different tools to work with their body. So like some things that maybe they could do at home a little bit as well. Nothing is too complicated. Many of the people in my classes have like all kinds of injuries and osteoporosis and the disc injuries, all the things, so like we're dealing with all of that kind of at the same time. I try to make the practice as general as possible. So most of them will be able to do as much of it as they can. Some people have like a knee injury. Some people have a hip injury. So people are also kind of modifying as they go. Sometimes somebody will sit something out or do something a little bit different. But the nature of the small group class is like, we actually kind of know each other. So like if one person is just like standing there for a second, nobody thinks it's weird because we all know each other. Sometimes somebody will ask a question in the class. We'll have a little chat. It's much more casual than the classes I used to teach when I was teaching in a big studio, where it's like the teacher is here and everybody's quiet and they all do what you do. It's a little bit more chill.
Yeah, it sounds really good. And sometimes, like from somebody like you that has so much experience, what you're calling something like simple and basic, somebody else is coming in and it's all new. So this isn't like simple stuff. This is really like squat. Okay, how do I? They don't know how to squat, and they don't know.
Yeah.
So to people that have with this ton of experience, like what we see is simple to somebody else. It's kind of hard to put ourselves like, what's it like? Okay, now I'm in front of you. I don't know anything, and I'm about to learn all this stuff. It's easy to kind of like get overwhelmed. And so, like, what are your who are like your like influences now? Or are you still like learning from your mom? Do you kind of like brainstorm with your mom? Do you go to her classes? Does she go to yours? Or like, what is it that you're doing yourself now?
So I live 4 hours east of where my mom lives. So she comes to visit. She doesn't teach a lot. She teaches a little bit, but she's like bordering on retired. She comes to visit me though, like, I don't know, frequently. She'll come take my class when she's in town. We talk, like we're pretty close. So we're in constant contact. We teach a retreat together every year. So we're in contact, but she's into her thing and I feel like I'm into my thing. And so, who are my main influences right now? It's so varied. My partner is an Olympic weightlifting coach. And we train together. Most of the training I do is done with him. Lately I've been doing weightlifting with him like at least once a week. So like whatever, power clean, push press, power snatch, stuff like that, stuff that I'm like really bad at. It's a little bit embarrassing to go train with his team, but whatever. Recently we've done more like fighting monkey work and fighting monkey training, which is super fun and like super intense. So that's been a little bit of what we've been up to. This past winter when we were in Mexico, we worked with one of Ito's teachers again. And so that was wonderful to just like, work with another teacher. My personal trainer who I worked with in Toronto, he is just so much inspiration for me. So, like I just interviewed him for my podcast a couple of days ago and just talking to him for an hour totally like rekindled everything that he had taught me. And so he's always in the back of my mind. He was a Poliquin coach and now he's gone on to do so many different things, but I've also done my coach's name is Lovedeep Dunna. He's like, he doesn't really put things on the internet though. So if you Google him, you won't even find him, which is one of these guys. I've done the Poliquin level 2. I love the Poliquin course. So I think if all else fails, I kind of like default back to that. But I really like to do a little bit of everything. I don't lift crazy heavy anymore. I'm not deadlifting double my body weight anymore. I love gymnastics. I think I'll always love gymnastics. I love crawling. So my movement practice now is super varied over the last 3 years. So I moved away from Toronto 3 years ago. And over those last 3 years, I haven't worked with that many teachers. I've worked with my coaches, but that's it. I work with my partner, done some fighting monkey work. I work with a physiotherapist in town and she helps me also like understand movement a little bit better. But it's kind of been like a 3-year incubation period of like really developing my own thoughts and my own ideas about movement and working on my own practice, because previous to when I moved away, I had taken a million different courses. I did training with Agatsu and that was also wonderful. Just so many different things. And so now it's been more like figuring out how I'm going to tie it all together and how to make this make sense for my own practice and then for people. But, the things that I do in my practice are different than what I teach, obviously.
It's a good approach to have. There's like so many like part of some of how I find my guests is I just get on Instagram and I just start scrolling.
Oh yeah.
And it's not like, there's, of course, there's all these like, like the Warrior 2 and the sunset and like that. I'll keep scrolling, but like if somebody like says something, like if they have like that's what attracts me a lot. Of course, if somebody's doing like really cool movement, I'll like, have you heard of cyber yoga, Lamont Good?
No.
He was on my podcast. He's really cool. He has some really neat things, but yeah, check him out. His on Instagram, it's cyber yoga, and his name is Lamont Good. And I think he has a lot of stuff that you would find fascinating. But I'm like looking and just like finding like who has these like different things, who's something different. So I've been kind of aware of what you were doing for a while now through your mom's group, and so it's cool to have you on and get your take on it. And I'm about out of questions. I could kind of like just talk about this kind of stuff for forever with you, but we could start to wrap it up. Is there anything that you were wanting to get into that we haven't touched on yet?
I don't think so. No, I think this has been great.
And so how can people find what you're doing? Like what's your podcast called? Where can we find that?
Yeah, so the podcast is called Mindful Strength. It's on my website. It's also on iTunes and Spotify and Stitcher and all the places where you can find podcasts. So if you just go into any podcast platform or app, it's called Mindful Strength. It'll come up. If people want to get in touch with me, they can do that on my website, which is probably the best place. It's Kathryn, Bruni-Young.com. It's Kathryn, Bruniyoung. And then on Facebook and Instagram, it's just all under my name. On Instagram, I tend to post lots of videos about movements and podcast quotes and stuff like that. There's so many things. I have a free online course. I have a few other online courses for strength and mobility and yoga and stuff like that. New projects are always coming up. So if people want to get in touch with me, there's lots of stuff to look at.
Yeah, I've seen what you offer. It is a lot of good stuff. All right, I guess we'll kind of wrap it up. Any last words for everyone?
I don't think so. Well, maybe try strength. Try strength, and strength doesn't have to be the opposite of yoga.
Yeah, that's really good. I appreciate you coming on. It was cool to get to know you more, and look forward to seeing what else you're doing. So I will stop the recording, and I'll talk to you for just a second when we stop.
All right.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.